Our reading today comes from John chapter 11, verses 1 to 4, and then from verse 17 to 26. If you have a Bible, it would be great to have it open with you, but we'll also have it on the screens in the rooms. John 11. Now a man named Lazarus was ill, and he was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay ill, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word for Jesus, "Lord, the one you love is ill." When he heard this, Jesus said, "This illness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." Then verse 17, on his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. "Lord," Martha said to Jesus, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha answered, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this?" This is the word of the Lord.
Well, good morning, everyone. We're continuing our series on seeing Jesus. And today, I want to talk about seeing Jesus who gives us life. Last week, Dan spoke beautifully about Jesus being our true friend. And there is a well-known phrase that you'll know when you talk about someone as being a friend for life. And Jesus is a true friend. And he is a friend for life. And he is a friend who gives us life. My great-granddad, a gentleman farmer called Arthur Goodman down in the West Country, he really was a good man. He was a godly Christian, a preacher, and he was a friend to many. In fact, he was generous to a fault, and he died in the 1930s, and it was said he had given away a fortune. He was owed a fortune in loans that he'd given to those who he counted as his friend. That was my inheritance. I'm still struggling with it. But his final words as he breathed his last, and when the Good Shepherd came to collect him and to take him to his eternal home, his final words were, "I found a friend." And Jesus, his friend, came to collect him and take him into eternity. In our reading today, we read about Lazarus, someone that Jesus specifically identifies as a dear friend. And Lazarus' sisters, Mary and Martha, have sent word to Jesus, and they've said, "Your dear friend is sick." They knew that if Jesus comes, he can make a difference. When we bring Jesus into our lives, when we bring Jesus into our situation, when we bring Jesus into whatever problem we face, he can make a difference. But Jesus delays a few days, and by the time that he arrives, Lazarus is dead. And Martha says, "If only you'd been here, he would not have died." The first thing I want to highlight for us this morning is this, that death is inevitable. Death's inevitable, and it comes to us all. On hearing that Lazarus is dead, we read that Jesus went to the tomb, and there are a crowd of mourners who are there weeping. And then it says, Jesus wept. It's the shortest verse in our Bible, perhaps the most poignant. And Jesus weeps with those who weep. That's sympathy. He feels pain for them. Jesus weeps for himself with empathy. He feels the pain himself. He feels the loss of a friend. And Jesus weeps in protest at death that ravages and wrecks and robs us of the life that he created in the first place. Eric Clapton famously sang, "There'll be no tears in heaven." And I think that's true. Scripture tells us that there will come a day when Jesus will wipe away every tear. But until then, I think heaven is full of tears, because I think that Jesus continues to weep when he sees the pain and the loss and the ravages that sin brings. He continues to weep with those who weep. Every community has its graveyard. Every community has its place of tombs, where the mourners gather and the mourners weep, and where the ground is moistened wet with tears. I've stood in many of them. And death is the universal experience. Death is the great leveler. And regardless of our status or our education or our background or our bank balance, whether we've lived a healthy life or an indulgent one, whether we've lived an altruistic life or a selfish one, death comes to us all. The mortality rate for humanity has always been 100%. St. Paul said, as in Adam, those born of Adam, as in Adam, all die. Elon Musk, we're told, may soon be the world's first trillionaire. But money can't elongate Elon's life. One day, and he can't take a cent with him. And there is no cryogenic hack for death. And there is no magic formula or elixir of life. And from the moment we take our first breath, we're on a clock to taking our last. Benjamin Franklin, who said, "Nothing is certain in life except death and taxes." And while we're not inoculated from death, here in our Western modern society, we are somewhat insulated from it. And the sick are held at arm's length. And we're distanced from dying. They're kept at a distance in a sanitized setting. And many of us, most of us perhaps, have never seen a dead body. But our ancestors lived closer to death and dying. Often happened at home. And they lived with it in view. And they were more connected to it. And as a result, they lived with eternity in view. If you look around this church, and I walked around this week and read again all the different memorials, all of them are to dead people. They are memento mori, they're remembrances that we are mortal and we will die. Put signs and symbols of death like skulls. And this idea of death for some brings a morbid fascination in what they read and what they watch online and so on. Perhaps that's a psychological defense mechanism against their own mortality. But for most, it leads to fear, to a kind of existential angst, to a dread that casts a shadow over their life. The anthropologist Ernest Becker said, or wrote, "The idea of death and the fear of it haunts the human animal like nothing else. It's the mainspring of human activity." We live in the face of death, and we live with the fear of death. I read an article this week about a 34-year-old designer. She said, "I'm scared I'll die before I actually start living." She went on to say that she spent her 20s trying to pay off her student loan and her 30s trying to raise money to put down as a down payment on a mortgage. And she said that she's afraid that the life that she imagines just keeps receding. Philip Larkin, a poet you'll know well, some of you, described as Britain's best-loved poet. He was also called the graveyard poet. I've read all his poems, and over again he returns to this theme of death. He was so afraid of it, and it robbed him of joy in living. And in one poem called The Old Fools, he writes this: ash hair, toad hands, prune face, at death you break up, and the bits that were you start speeding away from each other forever, with no one to see, and it's only oblivion. Why aren't they screaming? He screamed his whole life. If you want to understand Edvard Munch's famous painting Scream, the backdrop of it is living with death. When I was a young minister, I was a chaplain to an old people's home. Twice weekly we had lunch for the elderly that were brought in, and then we'd put on some entertainment, and I'd have to play my guitar and sing songs and things like that. And one day as I did the rounds and was saying hello, there was a new woman there, and she was blind. And as I approached, she turned, I was moving along the ranks, she turned to the person next, she said, "Who's that?" And the person said, "That's the vicar." And at that point she screamed, "Keep him away! Keep him away from me!" I thought, okay. And it turned out that as a vicar, I represented death. I was Reverend Death. Death and funerals. And though she couldn't see me, she was blind. She was filled with dread of what she thought I represented, and a reminder of where she was quickly heading to. Why aren't they screaming? Many people are screaming. They may not vocalize it, but inside they are screaming with dread and fear and angst at death that is inevitable and inescapable. They balk at it and they grasp at life. There is a fear of loss and a fear of the unknown, and perhaps even a fear of judgment that may be coming, and people don't feel ready. There'll be people here this morning. There'll be some of you watching online, and you are gripped. Maybe you've been gripped all your life by a fear of death, and it's robbed you of life. Well, that's the first thing. Death is inevitable. But the second thing is this, that life is freely available. As a minister, as a priest, I've performed many funerals, and they're all sad. They're all sad. Some are utterly tragic, but some are marked by, strangely, by hope and by joy. The priest meets the coffin as the hearse comes, and then processes in front of the coffin holding the dead person. And the words that the priest says that they begin with are the words of Jesus, that Jesus said to Martha here in our story when he heard that Lazarus was dead. In verse 25 he says, "I am the resurrection and the life. And whoever believes in me, even though they die, yet will they live." And it's an extraordinary and powerful moment when there you are, stood physically, viscerally, beside a dead body. You are speaking of revelation, you're speaking of resurrection, of life, of hope, of a future, and that this is not the end. And I've always thought this is perverse if it isn't true. This is sick if it isn't true. But how can we know whether it is or isn't? Well, we see here in this story that Jesus demonstrated his authority to make such a claim by then raising Lazarus from the dead. They're at the tomb, they're weeping. This is the end. There is no sequel. Their friend is dead. Jesus' friend is dead. But it ain't over till the fat lady sings or the fat angel sings. And he says, roll away the stone. Roll away that which stands between life and death and symbolizes death. And then he thanks his Father. And then he declares, Lazarus, come out. There's no ceremony, there's no fuss, there's just divine power behind the divine authority and the divine command, and the dead man rises. And up from the grave and out of the tomb, with a lung full of breath and a beating heart, is Lazarus. And Jesus says, take off the grave clothes, and hands him back. The name Lazarus in Hebrew means God has helped. And God does help, even in the face of death. And Jesus did what only God can do. Jesus has the authority to reverse the curse, the great curse of death. Jesus has the authority to traverse the great divide between God and humankind, between life and death, between time and eternity, between heaven and hell. The creator of the universe is there in the flesh, and he can overturn these laws of entropy and atrophy and death. And the God who declared at the start, let there be light, here is declaring, let there be life. And he is the one who can speak that life into being. We're told in the text that Lazarus had been dead 4 days. There was a particular Jewish belief, a Jewish tradition, that the spirit left the body at the point of death, but hovered over it until the 4th day. And they called that day the day of no hope. And Jesus delayed till the day of no hope. And when there is apparently no hope, Jesus brings hope and brings life. In that darkest hour, light and life shines. The second reason why we can have confidence, I can have confidence as a minister declaring those words, even at a funeral, I am the resurrection and the life, is because Jesus demonstrates his authority to state that by rising himself from the dead. They crucified him. They laid him in a tomb. They placed a stone in front to say, that's the end of it. But 3 days later, Jesus rose and is alive and rolls away the stone and rolls away everything that stands between us and God. I like what C.S. Lewis says. Jesus forced open a door that had been locked since the death of the first man. He has met and fought and beaten the king of death. And everything is different because he has done so. According to the Bible, we die because we sin. Our sin separates us from a holy God. And God is life. And God is pure. And in our sin, which pulls us away from him, we are pulled away from the source of life. And we wither and we die. Jesus never sinned, but he came to die in our place. He came to take the punishment we deserve for the wrong that we have done. And his death paid the price for our sin. And it cancelled it. And it conquered the consequence of our sin, which is death. And when Jesus rose again, it was proof that his death was sufficient as a sacrifice for the sins of the world. That he had conquered and broken the power of sin, which is death. And we who look to him and who put our trust in him and say yes to his yes to us and join our life with him. The benefits of his death and his resurrection are imputed, they're imparted, they are given to us. And though we die, yet we will rise with him. Jesus said, whoever believes in me will live forever. Whoever. And that goes all the way around the world, back through history and forward in time. Whoever means whoever. Whoever, whenever, whatever, however you've lived, if you look to him, and if you believe in him, and if you trust in him, and if you give your yes to him, and if you give your life to him, there is an exchange, and he gives his life to you. Here and now, he will be your best friend. And he, like the words of my great-grandfather, he is the friend who comes to us at that point of death and will take us into eternal life. And all we have to do is believe. We can't bring anything else to the table anyway. I spoke to a man once who said he hoped to go to heaven when he died. And then he confessed he had done some bad things. But then he said that he had actually rescued some battery hens. That was it. I said, oh, good. That's a good and noble thing. But all you got to do is believe. He ain't interested in how many battery hens you may or may not have rescued. He's interested in you believing and trusting and receiving. Here's the thing, saints. This is what I really want to convey today. No one wants you to live more than Jesus. No one hates death more than Jesus. No one has ever loved you like Jesus. No one has ever willed to be your friend like Jesus. And he formed you. And he saw you from afar. And he loved you. And he died for you. And he welcomes you. And he calls out to you. He chases after you. And he says, look to me and believe in me and come and spend forever with me. One of the greatest responsibilities of being an ordained minister, when we are ordained in the Church of England, we're given a charge, and in the liturgy it says that we are to prepare people for dying. And I have sought to do that and sat with many who are dying. And some are interested and want to hold on and receive the Lord. Others don't. I sat with a man once about to go in for surgery, very sick. I said, can I pray for you? He said, I've seen it this far on my own and I'll see it through. He never recovered from the surgery. I think of him often. But rather than prepare people for dying, I want to prepare people for living. And that is the offer that Jesus makes. That blind woman who initially refused to have me near her, who screamed, keep that vicar away. She gradually defrosted towards me, and eventually she invited me to her home. She told me about all the pain that she had suffered, about losing her eyesight, about losing her husband, taking offense at the church and the vicar, and projecting that onto me. And then, shortly after, she was taken ill. She was in hospital, and she was dying. And one morning, her son rang me, said, you've got to come in. There's been a miracle. You've got to come in and see my mum. Something amazing's happened. And I rushed into the hospital, and there she was, sat up, fully alive, radiant. And she told me, she's blind, she'd had a vision. And she'd had a vision of heaven. and of the beauty and the wonder. She spoke about the purity. She spoke about the singing. And somehow the Lord came to meet her in that moment. And he revealed himself to her. And even though she had lived a life rejecting him and hating the church, she softened and she responded to him and she received him. And a miracle had happened. And there she was, a woman who I first met screaming, a woman overwhelmed by the fear of death and anything that represented that, Dr. Death. Here she was, alive, telling her son, get the vicar in. I need to tell him what I've seen. I prayed with her, and very soon after that, she passed away. I can tell you that I did a funeral, and it was a party. It was one of those that when you stand beside the coffin and say, I am the resurrection and the life, whoever believes in me, though they die, yet will they live. It was a moment full of celebration because I knew it was true for her. And I know it is true for whoever says yes to him. And this is our faith. This is our belief. This is our hope. And this is our Jesus. And this is what he does. And this is what he gives if we will look to him and say yes to him. Amen.